So as of today, the 4 most popular native languages in the world are Mandarin, Hindi, Spanish, and English. And the first 3 of the top 4 accounts for almost 1.6 billion native speakers, whereas there are only about 340 million native English speakers. The ratio is almost 5-to-1. At the same time, all popular programming languages are written in English, including the ones created by non-native English speakers. For example, there's Python from Netherlands, Ruby from Japan, and Lua from Brazil. This all is to say that basically, if you aspire to be a programmer, you have to learn English first to some degree. Hence, the title of my talk, Programming 101, Learn English. We talk about internationalization and localization a lot for the products that we build because, well, we know that our audience is bigger than just English speakers. But then we don't apply the same kind of thinking to our very own industry. We talk about diversity, we know diversity in our workforce is super important, but then we are limiting our talents by assuming everyone capable of becoming a good programmer speaks English. In this talk, I want to first talk about some extra hurdles non-native English speakers have to go through in order to become a software developer. And then I'll explore how we as a community can help in removing these hurdles. So first step, memorize a bunch of words. This is a code example I took from an MDN article explaining how to use Object Prototype. If you are an English speaker, even if you are completely new to programming, you can probably still follow the logic just because you understand the words. But what if you don't? What if the word function means nothing to you, or the word constructor? To non-English speaker, a lot of these words don't mean anything. They're just symbols that have to be memorized. Now, here's a list of all the JavaScript reserved words. There are not so many, just 64 of them. And each of these words have special meanings in the context of JavaScript. And I ran this list of words through Google Translate and translated them to Japanese. I don't actually speak Japanese at all, so I'm not sure how bad the translation is, though I'm sure it's bad, so I apologize. The point I'm trying to make is just take a second to imagine that you, assuming you don't speak or you can't read any Japanese, you have to memorize all these symbols before you can write one single line of JavaScript or even understand a code example. And that doesn't end there. There are a few words here that did not even get translated by Google Translate because they're not really English words. For example, there's char derived from character, const derived from constant, eval from evaluate. To you, that is probably super straightforward, but if you already have trouble understanding English, that's one extra layer of abstraction. Honestly, coding in a foreign language is basically like coding an emoji. I mean, when you think about it, language is really just arbitrary symbols with meanings attributed to them, kind of like emojis. And if you want to know what that's like, this is a real thing. This actually compiles and runs. It's called emoji code. I just took this sample from the documentation. I tried to write something myself. I couldn't quite figure it out. It's not easy. So if you want to kind of get a glimpse of what it's like to code in a foreign language, try out emoji code. So step 2, you have to learn to find answers on your own. Can I get a show of hands how many of you here are comfortable with speaking and writing in English? Okay, that's, yeah. And sorry, keep your hands up though if you have ever felt intimidated or scared or worried that you'll come off as stupid when you pose a question online. Right. Now imagine you have to do that in a language that you're not comfortable with. Programming is not something that you can just learn in a classroom with a chalkboard. We rely on Google and online communities a lot when it comes to learning and finding answers. Unfortunately, a lot of these communities are English only, and many intend to keep it that way. Stack Overflow, for example, has an English-only policy. The reasons being, it's not their goal to teach English, and that the question askers have to put in effort into the questions. You can't see me up here, but I'm rolling my eyes pretty hard right now. And it has the following advices for the moderators. Question written in non-English should be closed immediately as unclear what you're asking, and answers written in non-English should be flagged as, quote, very low quality, although not an answer is generally okay too. Even if the question posters did bite the bullet and decide to post something in English, but with a little bit of grammatical error, good luck. They will then encounter a lot of really hostile comments telling them to try harder and be less lazy, as if posting a question in their second language is not trying hard enough. Oops, sorry. So, faced with, oh, my GIF is not playing. Oh well. It says, English motherfucker, do you speak it? So faced with hostility like that, obviously non-native speakers' imposter syndrome, which we all know what it is already, would be further exacerbated. This is partly why even if non-native speakers are fluent enough to browse articles or resources in English, many still don't feel comfortable enough to post themselves. When it comes to language learning, there's passive skills and active skills. Passive language skills refer to listening and reading, whereas active language skills refer to writing and speaking. And active language skills is a lot scarier than passive, simply because you're putting yourself out there for criticism. And as I mentioned before, this criticism online can be pretty harsh and disheartening. Oh, sorry. So let's say a non-native speaker has gone through all the hurdles and have become a great programmer. Now, they have to convince people that they can communicate. Because some people would say, well, communication skills are important. I can't hire someone who can communicate with the rest of my team. The thing is, there's a misconception that fluency in a language is the same thing as communication skills, which is not true. Yes, communication skills does require a good command of the language, but a high degree of fluency is irrelevant. Communication skills is how you organize ideas, how you present them, how you explain a complex theory, and all this can be done without a large set of vocabularies or perfect grammar. Let me take a step back. So I'm not going to deny that there are indeed many benefits that come with people being able to speak one common tongue. It allows us to collaborate, to work together, and achieve great things together. I'm not at all against English, and I don't think having a global language is bad at all. However, I am against making English a barrier of entry. I believe that here, in this world of people that already speak English fluently, we have the power. We have the power to lower or even eliminate this barrier of entry. And I think we can start by making learning accessible to everyone, regardless of language. Node.js recently published results of a survey they did on their user base. One very interesting stats they found was that 95% of their users learn Node using English resources. At the same time, almost 50% learn Node in their non-native language. So what does that mean? Does that mean that almost half the people couldn't find good enough resources in their native language to learn from? Kind of, but it's actually a little bit more complex than that. To illustrate my point, there's this graphic illustration of what I call current stage of learning resources by language. So here you see there's this I'm going to call it the English world. You have all these up-to-date, super useful, first-class citizen documentations, and there are these huge, vibrant communities built around tools that you can use and learn from and be a part of. Rainbow, unicorns, basically everything awesome. And now look at this non-English world. You get these half-translated, probably out-of-date, kind of sad documentation, and smaller, not very active communities. The problem with this ecosystem is that these worlds are completely separated. If you do the learning in your own language, you can't take what you learn outside of that world. To give you an example, let's say there's this new exciting tech, I don't know what's like the newest buzzword, machine learning Hyperloop.js. You want to learn about it, but let's say you don't speak English very well, Chinese is your first language. So fortunately, there's documentation on that in Chinese. So you read all about it, you formed very educated opinions on this, what was it? Machine learning Hyperloop JS. But because you read it in Chinese, you don't know this thing is actually called machine learning Hyperloop JS in English. And as a result, you're completely unable to take your new learned knowledge outside of this Chinese programming world and participate in any discussion about this topic in English. And as I mentioned before, communities built around the English language is generally more active and vibrant. So this is kind of a slippery slope. Basically, when you learn here, you're stuck here. A lot of the documentation translation efforts, while totally well-intended, actually can create segregations by being overly translated. Every aspiring developer who has ever tried to learn in their native language knows that all the good stuff, all the useful resources are available in English. That's why many would rather struggle and spend way more time and effort looking up words in dictionaries, but still would prefer the English docs over the ones in their native language. And the ones that do read docs in their native language oftentimes would open their native language one and the English one side by side for comparison, in case the non-English docs are not properly translated or outdated, and also so that they could learn at the same time. So here, I would like to propose to all of you to stop considering documentation translation as just something you have to do or just a mean to get information across to non-English speakers, but think of it as a bridge between the English and the non-English dev worlds. To sum it up, well-done documentation translation should be up-to-date, not overly translated, so only aim to translate the learning, not the terminologies. Keep the keywords, API method names, all that in English. If you do have them translated, that's fine, but make sure you have the original English term easily accessible, either put it in parentheses or link to it in the docs. All in all, it should be seen as a tool that enables non-English speakers to extend their learnings further. One example that does all of those things are the Angular Chinese documentations. I was so impressed when I found it. It's very well translated, super up to date, and the best part is that you can click on each line. Is it playing? Okay, yes. The best part is that you can click on each line of the translation and get the original English string for comparison or to get more context. This is by far the best doc translation effort I've ever seen. So empathy, we talk about that a lot, but I still want to highlight that specifically in the context of interacting with programmers that happen to not speak English very fluently. If you ever encounter questions posed online in less than perfect English, try to empathize. Yes, I know that improper grammar keeps you up at night, it makes you lose your appetite. But trust me, the person posting the question knows very, very well that their English is not perfect. But they're still putting themselves out there just because they want to learn. Don't discourage that. And when you direct question askers to their native language resources, you're not at all doing them a favor. You're essentially telling them, hey, you don't belong here. Go back to where you came from. What you can consider doing instead is, if you can understand what they want to say, then edit the question or comment on it and improve upon it. If you're not sure, state what the parts that you do understand and then ask or confirm the rest in a comment. Basically, meet them halfway. Help them out if you can. Yes, this approach is going to take more time and effort than to just ask them to leave, but it does help create a more welcoming and inclusive environment. And a lot of the times, you just have to be the first person to do that, and other people are going to follow. Lastly, when it comes to the topic of non-native English speakers receiving hostility in communities due to their less than perfect English, one very common response I hear is that, well, English is my second language too, and I have no problem mastering it or learning proper grammar. If I can do it, other people should be able to as well. Anyone using that English as a second language excuse is just lazy. Well, to people that think that, good for you for mastering what a lot of people have struggled to do so, and I sincerely congratulate you on your exquisite command on the English language. I know that wasn't easy, I'd been there, but here's a gentle reminder that your story is not universal, and other people may very well have different experiences. Maybe you were fortunate enough to receive English education since young. Maybe you were raised in an environment with a lot of exposure to English pop culture. Or maybe simply because your native language is just a lot more similar to English than a lot of other languages. And many people just don't have that kind of exposure, that kind of privilege to these opportunities and resources. So basically, don't shit on other people's journey just because you have gone through it already. I think 2-3 days ago, Apple CEO Tim Cook told a French media outlet that he thinks for kids around the world today, it's more important to learn to code than to learn English. I mean, that's cute, I guess. The truth is the web is very skewed. English content still dominates the web. And the playing field is just not even for programmers who don't speak English very well. As much as I wish things were different, just because of how things went down in history, English is indeed the closest we have ever come to having a global language. And as things stand now, English is here to stay as the de facto language of programming. But we here, the ones that are reaping the benefits of already knowing the language well enough, we have the responsibility to level out the playing field for those who don't. If we want diversity in our talent, we have to embrace diversity in full, and that includes diversity in language as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was so excellent.
Okay. Oh, yeah, you can come over here. Okay, so something that made me think about was, and I'm wondering your thoughts, if you don't have the resources for translation and keeping translation update, do you think it's worthwhile, or do you think that there's also a problem in the way that English documentation is written? Is it written at a higher level than it could be? And is it worth writing at a lower level of English? Well, maybe I'm not explaining this right. I mean, even when I read documentation oftentimes in English, my native language, I have to parse it and read it over technical documentation. And I think that there could be better ways to write technical documentation so it isn't so off-putting for everyone, and maybe that could help level the field. Do you think that that's...
Yeah, I think that's just using simpler language. I think if you're going to make it easy for everyone. And people that don't speak English very well will benefit from it as well.
So, are there any programming languages, and my apologies if you said it and I missed it, but do you know of any languages that are written not in English?
Yeah, there are several. I don't recall the names because they're not in English. So I do remember someone ported a version of Python over to Chinese. And it's basically they just translated all the reserved words to Chinese, so like the if would be like the Chinese word for if. And that was mostly for educational purposes.
Excellent. So one more round of applause. And if you'll just